It was the early 1980s, and on the gritty streets of New York City, a man was hard at work tagging train cars in broad daylight. The man, known as Cap NPC, had a particular approach to making his art, an approach that made him infamous. Cap was known for going over or crossing out other artists' work by painting his own name over theirs. While most graffiti artists had an unwritten rule of mutual respect, Cap threw that rule out of the window. He'd cover up intricate, meticulously crafted pieces with sloppy bubble letters, angering legends like Dondi, Lee, and Zephyr. Cap, unrepentant, explained his philosophy as, "I destroy all lines." His approach wasn't about style or skill, it was about chaos. And as for the other writers, they hated him, calling him a toy with no style. Despite the disdain, Cap became a figurehead of the underground, embodying the wild, rebellious energy of graffiti. Whether you saw him as a villain or the king of the streets was up for debate. But one thing was clear, just like the respected graffiti artists he wrote over, his name was impossible to ignore.
Even though graffiti has been around as long as people have drawn on walls, modern graffiti began in the 1960s. In Philadelphia, gangs drew their signs on public spaces to mark territory. It was a practical way to denote boundaries without spilling any blood. However, along the way, Cornbread wrote his name next to the signs, and unlike the gangs, he didn't do it for claim, but for self-expression.
Around the same time, New York became a cultural hub for artistic experimentation and youthful rebellion, giving birth to movements like hip-hop and breakdancing. Early graffiti artists in New York City started independently, the most influential of which, Taki183, became the Cornbread of New York City. He started because he was bored and liked seeing his name all over the city. Through his prolific writing spree, he inspired others to write, creating communication between artists that blossomed into a movement.
I grew up in the Bronx. Me and my friend FJC4 were dropping off some legal papers in Queens. His father was a lawyer, and we just took a marker out. We never thought we'd see the tag again, but on the way back, we caught the same train and it already had some other writing next to it. It was like a communication. Tracy 168.
These asynchronous artists would eventually start to meet up at spots that were known as benches to share info on which sites were hot and new styles like wild style or computer letters. It would also be where the terms for graffiti would be coined that are still used to this day, such as tags, which are quick writings of a name of one color, throw-ups, which are slightly more complex than tags, using more elaborate lettering and more colors, pieces, which are full-scale pieces of art with large, elaborate, and detailed letter forms, and finally sprawls, which are massive in size using lettering that can be seen from miles away. On top of that, it serves a realization that graffiti artists were of every race and that they could come together and bond over the movement they all called home. Some of these artists would take it a step further and form graffiti groups called crews, such as the Prisoners of Graffiti, POG, the 3 Yard Boys, 3YB, and the Bad Yard Boys, BYB.
However, one major difference between New York and Philadelphia, and ultimately what made New York so influential, was its use of subways. The subways were both where the movement started, connecting artists from all over the city, but also where the movement would gain the most public attention. By the mid-70s, many subway cars were so completely covered, top to bottom in paintings, that it was impossible to see out of windows. For writers, this was the golden age.
When Lindsay was mayor, each train you painted would actually run for years. It was beautiful. It was like thousands of rolling billboards. Blade.
By this point, the movement had evolved beyond simple tags into free, unfiltered creative expression, and an opportunity for fame, evident through artists like Lee and John 156. Lee's works commented on social issues, while John 156's unique abstracts distinguished him. It even coincided with the growth of hip-hop. Breakdancing, rapping, and DJing. Both were an outlet for self-expression, and they worked in tandem to grow graffiti culture. As graffiti grew, however, it faced hostility from city officials.
In the 70s and 80s, New York City was struggling, plagued with high crime and economic collapse after narrowly avoiding bankruptcy in 1975. After the city cut public services, New Yorkers wanted solutions. And in 1982, scientist George Kelly proposed one, the broken windows theory. To prevent larger crimes, law enforcement would crack down on minor offenses such as loitering, public drinking, and, of course, vandalism.
As NYC's graffiti culture expanded, it clashed with this theory and its manifestation. To artists, graffiti was self-expression. To supporters, vandalism. In 1984, responding to graffiti, the MTA began a 5-year campaign to cleanse its trains. While a war on graffiti had been declared by Mayor John Lindsay in 1972, the city had lacked the resources to enforce it. This time, though, the MTA hired Kelly as a consultant, fully committing to the fight.
Graffiti was turned into a real crime, with these laws enforced harshly and trains instantly being taken out of service when spray painted on. Finally, the MTA and the city were starting to get results. Graffiti was moving off the subways. However, it didn't instantly eradicate subway graffiti. In response to the MTA's campaign, a community of diehards emerged, artists that wouldn't stop for any policy, any restriction the MTA imposed on them. Each time the MTA tried to stop these artists, they would find a way to slip through the cracks. They tried painting all their subway cars white. All it did was provide the diehards with a fresh canvas to work with. They tried putting up barbed wire around the yards, guarded by German shepherds. That worked until the artists figured out you could just distract the dogs with food and cut the fences.
Eventually, the MTA did win out, even over the diehards, losing its newcomer community due to major deterrents. Graffiti culture was weakening, and the MTA only made it harder for graffiti culture to stay on the subways. In 1989, the final painted car was removed from service, symbolically winning the war on graffiti.
A lot of people became discouraged from riding on the subways because some of these toys started destroying our work. Nico. Things had reached the peak of achievement artistically. Lee.
However, to the artists, the subways weren't a war, they were only a battle in a war that was not yet over. They simply moved from the subways to new places where they still could write. They would write anywhere, not only on public facilities, but on private shops, homes, and most prevalently, on rooftops. They would even move into the tracks and tunnels of the subway system itself. This would be when graffiti was most visible to the public. This also had the unintended effects of making graffiti an even more widespread movement, and also subjecting it to the most public scrutiny. By this point, the people of New York had lived with graffiti for almost 2 decades. For many, change was long overdue.
Although I am sure the drafters of the Anti-Vandalism Act would like to take credit for this change, I don't believe the enactment of 2 misdemeanor crimes had much to do with the abatement of graffiti, since graffiti artists could always be prosecuted for felonies under the criminal mischief statutes before and after the act was passed. Rather, I believe the public got fed up with young men and women damaging property that did not belong to them. Dan Allen, a former NYC prosecutor who handled hundreds of graffiti cases.
Slowly but surely, through constant efforts in the 90s and 2000s, graffiti as an illegal movement would fade out. While not dead, the movement had come a long way from its origins as a means of expression among lower-class communities. The city determined that in a controlled setting, graffiti could be beautiful, and that it can be seen as a legitimate form of art. Today, many of the key figures of the 70s and 80s still create art in more legal means.
Graffiti is a voice for those in society whose voices are often overlooked. Since its creation in Black and Latino neighborhoods, it's empowered minority and marginalized communities, making their voices heard. And as it's developed, it's evolved into a striking and controversial form of free speech, which, even if controversial, is something every American has the right to. But when that right to free speech clashes with the societal efforts and government responsibility to uphold order, think the broken windows theory of the 80s, among other modern issues it faces, things get complicated. Graffiti, born from the streets of underprivileged communities, faces an identity crisis. What was meant to empower has now become commodified, with corporations and brands like Supreme exercising a sanitized, marketable version of a graffiti aesthetic, while the communities graffiti was born to represent are criminalized and persecuted for exercising their right to free speech, like on the streets of LA, where graffiti done mainly by Black and Latino artists is more likely to be categorized as a crime. As graffiti becomes sanitized, its authenticity as a source of power for minority communities is lost, and, in many cases, even excludes the communities from their own voice in the neighborhood, as said neighborhoods are gentrified and the graffiti is diluted and exploited for profit. So, now it falls to us to question, when the right to free speech that graffiti was born out of clashes with gentrification, racial tensions, and the responsibility of the government to uphold public order, who decides what graffiti goes, and at what cost to the communities graffiti was born from?